So those of you who have questions, use the chat function. And Jesse, will you alert us when we see a question that Mike can address?
Yes, I will. I'd like to start with a question. Mike, Vice President, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have no special knowledge about what Joe Biden's going to do, of course, but he made clear very early on that he was going to take on a woman as his vice presidential candidate. And this was a very significant commitment because, as you know, women are a majority of the population, a majority of the electorate. They vote at a higher rate than men. And to the extent that there will be important turnout considerations here, I think that this is a very smart strategic move. He has a very talented roster of female possibilities for vice president. Obviously, he can only select one, but I believe that he will use some of these women in his cabinet, and there will be key appointments. And I suspect that he'll have some statement to make, not immediately, because he doesn't want to disturb or the coverage of the vice presidential selection. But eventually he'll get to a point where he'll talk about possible cabinet positions for some of these other women.
Michael, how reliable are the polls? We were told Clinton was way ahead, and that may have depressed the Clinton vote. Also, regarding the polls, who answers their phones these days? Thanks, Liz.
So let me say that the national polls have actually been getting more accurate over time. And they estimated that Hillary Clinton would win the national popular vote by about 3 percentage points, and she won it by about 2.5 percentage points. However, the state polls were systematically biased in their estimates against Donald Trump. And there's a very excellent report from the American Association for Public Opinion Research about why that might be the case. First of all, polls are like any other consumer product. You get what you pay for. The state polls are paid for by local news outlets by and large. They have smaller budgets. And one thing that happened in 2016 was when Hillary Clinton jumped out to a lead, they stopped polling to save money. So we didn't have very many late estimates of support for Hillary Clinton in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. There are also some issues about the weighting of the data. The pollsters don't ordinarily weight by education. Across the last several elections, there's been a shift in support for Democrats and Republicans according to levels of education. Where we used to think of people with higher socioeconomic status, higher SES, being more likely to be Republican. They're now more likely to be Democratic. And people with lower levels of education, if you think back to in our lifetime, the relatively old days, union members with lower levels of education generally supported Democrats. Of course, there are now fewer union members, and people with lower levels of education are more likely to support Republicans. So we have to keep these factors in mind when assessing polls and their estimates.
Mike, Jerry wants to know if you think Biden would benefit from contrasting his policies with those of Trump.
No, I don't think he would, because the Trump campaign is going to be run on the basis of personal attacks and these cultural appeals racial and ethnic divisions in society. And I think it would be a losing proposition for Biden to say, Trump wants to do this, I want to do that. He should be promoting his policies for their inherent value, at the same time emphasizing his own personal qualities implicitly in terms of empathy for different groups in society, being a caring person, and so on. There are some structural issues, I think, on which Trump could be vulnerable, namely his inability to deal with the Congress. There's no drafting of legislation that comes out of the White House. The president has found this new strategy to his liking of declaring an emergency and then producing executive orders and memoranda, thereby avoiding having to deal with the Congress. He, I think, always understood in his real estate business the power of suing people, or the way in which he could defend himself in court to forestall decisions that ran contrary to his interests. And I think he's brought that to the White House as well. In general, the legal system seems to be holding up pretty well, but the process is very slow. And in the meanwhile, he's doing a lot of things while some of his policies are tied up in the courts.
Mike Marcy has a question about likely voters, and please describe circumstances where they can be either overstated or understated. For instance, many Michigan voters did not vote for Clinton, but did vote down ballot for Democrats. We don't know if they were deemed highly likely voters or not.
So this is a very complicated issue for pre-election pollsters all over the world, because, first of all, we call this the likely electorate because the electorate doesn't actually form or take shape until election day. So we have to make an estimate of who we think are the most likely to turn out. And the problem is that in the United States, about 55% of registered, about age-eligible people turn out to vote. So the pollsters have to decide which half of their sample they're going to include in their estimate of the outcome. And there are a variety of ways to estimate the electorate. The pollsters think of this as partly their kind of secret source. They don't divulge a lot of details about this because some pollsters think it gives them a competitive advantage over other pollsters. I think that we're seeing a trend now, just beginning, where some pollsters are producing alternative estimates of the outcome based upon differential turnout. And I think that's a useful thing to do. In the past, the likely electorate, the likely voter estimate was a point estimate of what they thought was the most likely outcome. But I think that as contemporary American campaigns have switched from campaigns of conversion, here's where I stand, here's where my opponent stands, your position is closer to mine, you should vote for me. They have turned into campaigns of mobilization and demobilization, identifying my voters, making sure they get a ballot, and trying to prevent the supporters of the other candidate from getting a ballot in their hands. So that's also complicated the role of the state level pollsters. I would say one more thing. If you're constructing a likely voter model, many pollsters start with the notion that the electorate will look like the electorate last time, maybe with some small modifications. And if voting behavior changes drastically, as it did relatively speaking in 2016, where the pattern of relative turnout in urban and rural areas shifted dramatically, then the likely voter models can be off. The pre-election pollsters also weren't weighting by these differential education levels, which I think they understood after the election was a problem, and hopefully they've incorporated that into their likely voter models this year. We'll have to see how well that works.
Tina wants to know how you assess the impact of the Biden supporters' 67% anti-Trump sentiments relative to the enthusiasm factor for him.
I think that's a potential problem as it relates to turnout. It doesn't affect the likelihood of their voting for Biden if they get to the polls or if they get a ballot in their hand. But if I were a candidate, I would much rather have enthusiastic supporters of me rather than people who were opposed to my opponent. But we'll have to see how that plays out.
Al wants to know about the post office. What impact do you think the game playing that's going on will impact the election?
Well, I have a theory about this. Maybe 25 years ago, I had a research project in Oregon trying to understand the first vote by mail election there. And I studied voting by mail for some time. I know that many of you are active in politics, and you understand that an election is a very complicated audit process in which you have to certify who's eligible to run. You have to organize the printing of the ballots to make sure that's correct. You have to account for every ballot, whether it stays in your office or it gets to the polls or it gets mailed and so on. Voting by mail has been used for 25 years across the country to different extent in different states. It can be a very secure and accurate process. It requires, however, time and money. It's more expensive to run a vote by mail election than it is to run a polling place election. For example, in most locations, you're not allowed to start counting ballots until the polls close. The polls would close, that have voting in person. That's because this is meant to be a precaution against leaking of early results. So the burden on an election administrator is heavy. It involves a bigger staff, and it will be more time consuming. We're not going to know the results of the 2020 election for a few days. I think that the part of the Republican strategy is stalling through the month of August into September. Maybe this will involve some lawsuits because the local election administrators will need more money to organize and administer large amounts of voting by mail. If they don't get it by September, when their normal processes kick in, they won't be able to do this securely, and they'll refuse to run a vote by mail election. So I think that this is partially a stalling tactic, including not voting on the Democratic bill from the House that had money for vote by mail elections. which is part of a low turnout strategy, a voter suppression strategy.
Jerry wants to know, Mike, if debates are likely to make a difference.
Debates haven't historically made a difference. We'll have to see if this year's debate series will be different. You know that already 2 universities who went through very elaborate proposals to secure debate locations, Michigan and Notre Dame, have now given up the opportunity to host the debate. One thing that's interesting is if you go back to 1960, the first debate between Kennedy and Nixon, it was held in a television studio without any audience. And through a process over time into the 80s, well, there were no debates until 1980. And then in the 80s, we got this commission for presidential debates that took control of this. They turned them into made-for-television events with very fancy backdrops and also with a live audience. We're going to have debates this year without any audience again. And the quality of the debates often depends upon the moderators of the debates. But it'll be interesting to see the contrast in styles between Biden and Trump, but I don't expect that they will have very much impact on candidate preference.
Mike, Steve Rhodes asked why lower education and income voters tend to support Trump when he has done so little for them.
Well, things could change, but you remember that in 2016, he ran as an outsider. And the appeal that he had in 2016, I think, was related to anxiety among whites about their future as a majority in the country, and also about the growing income inequality, the way in which they suffered in the recovery after the 2008-2009 decline. So these were essentially lower SES voters who were suffering, relatively speaking, to others in society, either in their current circumstances, the economic status, or in their view about their prospects for the future. It could be different this time, although there's no reason to believe that their anxiety about racial and ethnic divisions in American society have changed. They've probably been exacerbated. I mean, the whole metaphor of build a wall and keep out the foreigners at the southern border was an appeal of this kind. The president will return, has begun to return to these themes already. The notion of giving his acceptance speech, I assume you're all following the news. The notion of giving his acceptance speech in 2 weeks at Gettysburg is really a startling example of this kind of appeal.
Doug Scott's on the board of canvassers and tells us that only 600 absentee voters in Washtenaw County were disqualified for arriving after the polls closed. Don't know if that's a high or a low number, but
are those mail ballots, you mean, that were postmarked late, or?
Yes, I'm assuming that's the case.
Yeah, not in-person people who got to the polls late.
Doug, you want to unmute and answer Mike's question?
Yes, these were strictly ballots that came in after the polls closed Tuesday at 8 o'clock. So no, Mike, they weren't people who walked in or anything like that. No.
Yeah, it was a mail delivery problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or the people just, tried to get it in 2 days ahead and shouldn't have, you know.
Right. This is the problem with the post office. Why the Postal Service is going to go through a reorganization in the next 90 days, right before an election, makes this behavior subject to, whether you're a conspiracy theorist or not, makes this action subject to a particular interpretation about depressing turnout. Because if you look at there was a report just in the last couple of days, for example, about voting in the Michigan primary, where more than, I think almost 80% of the votes came in by mail. In the 2016 election, I think 42% of the votes were cast before Election Day. That includes voting by mail, absentee ballots, early voting places, and in some locations. The expectation now, currently, is that almost 60% of the votes in this election, the presidential election, will be cast before Election Day.
Bruce wants to know a little more about your thoughts on the role of social media in the election and future elections.
Well, the role of social media is related pretty directly to targeting, micro-targeting. So we're moving away, in campaign terms, we're moving away from broadcasting to narrowcasting, making appeals directly to individuals. When we can identify what their interests are by their posts on Twitter, the Facebook groups they belong to, whether they're active on Reddit, and so on. So it is relatively cost efficient for campaigns. Keep in mind that both Biden and Trump are going to spend over $1 billion, just as Clinton and Trump did in 2016, to be able to target the individual voters. So the messaging is more direct, and it's also, relatively speaking, more hidden. That leaves aside the question of the influence of other groups, including foreign groups, on the behavior and the formation of preference among Americans. So this kind of narrow casting, this kind of targeting is clearly the wave of the future. There are not that many Americans who use Twitter. I think it's around 30%, but there are almost 70% who have some association with Facebook. So the use of social media will be a growing influence in American campaigns, and the targeting of messages. I should add, there's one other thing too, which is the ability of the campaigns to harvest data from social media, combine them with other commercially available data to increase the accuracy of their micro-targeting based upon what you read, what you buy, and then to model that statistically in terms of what kind of appeals would be most relevant to you.
I'm afraid we're going to have to conclude. Don't want to abuse your time, or yours, Mike. Mike, this was fantastic. I know the people on the session got a great deal out of this because I was monitoring, as I always do on a Zoom session, to see how many people drop off. And you had the fewest drop-offs percentage-wise than I've ever seen on a Zoom call. So I think that's both an appreciation of what the value of what you had to say, and the fact that at least here we have a very engaged electorate. And I want to appeal to you, voters, and to be involved in this election. As Mike says, this is a turnout election. And I'm involved, as many of the people on this session are involved, with a Get Out the Vote program this year, particularly an absentee ballot Get Out the Vote program. And we have identified those voters who requested an absentee ballot, who are likely Democratic voters, who did not turn it in the primary election just concluded. And we're going to be targeting them and would love to have your help in reaching out to them and others. There are several 100,000 likely Democratic voters who are projected not to vote in this election in Michigan, and we've got to get them out. So with that, thanks to all of you. There will be a video recording of this session. And Mike, I may be even asking you, if not under PEG's sponsorship, some other organization, to speak to us again, because we had to turn away a lot of people tonight, and I could see the emails coming in during the session of friends of mine who knew my email address who were frustrated. But with that, I wish you all good health and to stay strong and to get involved. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the invitation.